Well, it's Wednesday at lunchtime again, and I'm grateful that we have these times that we can set aside and come in to talking um, and sort of exploring and doing some education together and looking at new information. And I've had several people ask me recently about methods to burn fat, and I wanted to talk a little bit about how we can stabilize blood sugar and how that's a key component of burning fat again. Many of you know that we've had this discussion many times, and I I know that that's sometimes feels like it's redundant almost when we go over it again and again, but I think it's something that I keep trying to learn, and everybody else seems to be learning along with me as well. If you can't hear me, please somebody give me a holler because right now I can't tell if I'm muted or not, but I think that you can hear me. Robert, maybe send me back just a note to make sure that you've got audio hearing me because it's telling me that I'm muted. You know, one of the sort of confusing aspects, I guess I would say, around healthcare is to know how to really move the needle on the foods that we eat and the diet that we choose. And I've had a number of patients say to me, how am I supposed to know who to believe or what to listen to? And it would be so much easier if there was a one-size-fits-all approach. If we could just all of us know that, you know, there was one way to do it and we all needed to strive towards that, that would make life seem simpler. And I've often said it just takes one walk through Barnes and Noble to know why we're all confused when you think about the number of different sources of information that we each have coming at us and how difficult it is to sort of cut through that confusion. So I'm going to go back to discussing today about what's underneath programs that work for health around dietary adjustments and burning fat. And one of the easiest ways I would say to understand a dietary decision tree, if you want to think of it that way, is to think about the question, what are you optimizing for? Or what are your goals? Because many times we'll have a lot of different goals that we're trying to address with one approach. So maybe my goal is to lose weight, or my goal is to burn fat, which those two I would see generally as the same thing. So that could be one goal. Another goal might be to lower inflammation. Another goal might be to have more energy. Another goal might be to prevent cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease. Those are all goals where diet has a major impact. And in fact, even like all of our psychologic health has a major impact of diet. Alzheimer's prevention, huge impact of diet. Heart disease prevention, huge impact of diet. And I would say that all of those different states that we don't want to get to and the state of optimal health that we do want to each get to have some nuances of how we do that that make choosing our diet individualized. It makes it different for each person, and our genetics certainly impact why it could be different for each person. But what I would say, and for our talk today, I'm going to talk about how to stabilize blood sugar, which in turn stabilizes insulin and lowers insulin. The reason I'm going to talk about that is that if you look at all of the things I just mentioned, lowering the rates of Alzheimer's disease, lowering the rates of heart disease, making my blood flow really great in my body, having plenty of energy because my mitochondria are working fabulously, all of those results will occur with a diet that decreases inflammation. So if we think about optimizing for these two things, stabilizing the blood sugar and insulin, which then in turn, number two, decreases inflammation, that approach, using that as sort of my marker of, is this a program that's going to work for me or not, is really a good place to start. I use that sort of as one of my filters around dietary choices. And then from there, I would say you might end up making decisions based on several other things. A person might choose, for instance, to do a pescatarian diet where they're mostly vegetarian plus fish, for instance, because of their beliefs or because of that having other things that would be optimized. Or a person might choose a paleo diet or a ketogenic diet. But some of those choices can really be more around what you like or what's convenient for you, or some genetic testing that we've proven that one is better than the other. So I hope that's a little bit clear that what I'm going to talk about today is really about optimizing for fat burning or for lowering of inflammation, and that the way that we can do that is through stabilizing blood sugar and lowering insulin. So I'm going to share our screen so that we can look at some slides that'll guide us through some pictures that may help us a little bit with those concepts. So hang in with me for just a moment. There we go. So stabilizing blood sugar. In my mind, I put the two terms together. Stabilizing blood sugar and lowering insulin go hand in hand. They work with each other. You can't do one without the other. So when I say stabilizing blood sugar, I tend to think that that's a really easy way that most people in our society now understand what that at least kind of is about, even if they don't know exactly how to do it. They realize that a stable, good blood sugar is a really key component to health. And what I know internally, and the way that I check on that through your blood work, is to check on an insulin level and to check on your blood sugar levels to see if a person's doing that. So I want to talk about why and how stabilizing our blood sugar impacts our health, and how the blood sugar interrelates with insulin, and then different methods that you can use to stabilize blood sugar. I'm going to talk specifically about our OPTIBIA program today because it fits with every parameter that stabilizes blood sugar and helps lower insulin. And then I'm also going to talk about diets that have some intermittent fasting involved with them, and briefly about ketogenic diets, because each of those has aspects that help stabilize blood sugar that I want to talk about. My hope is that by talking about the way that this works, we can each start to learn to individualize our own program, so that if you're standing at Rubio's and you're trying to decide what choice do I make that's going to stabilize my blood sugar or be good for me, that if you know some of the principles behind that impact, you'll be able to make those choices more easily. So we know that inflammation is sort of the key component to most of our disease processes. It's kind of like domino number one to cancer changes, to heart disease, to Alzheimer's disease, to our autoimmune disorders, to neurologic diseases or diabetes. And so when we think about inflammation, one of the things that functional medicine has trained me to think about, and it's the beauty about functional medicine, and that is to think functional medicine says, let's ask the question, why? Let's look at what's behind the whole process of inflammation and the reason that it exists in our body to begin with. So that's what I want to talk about. This slide gives us a huge clue as to what causes inflammation in the body. We know that if insulin is high, and that's this red dotted line, if insulin is high, that will equal inflammation. There's a whole bunch of effects of high insulin. It raises our cortisol level, which is our stress hormone. And together, those are our storage hormones that help us store fat and save it for either continuing to fuel muscles as you're running from the tiger that stress might have been induced by, or literally store that fat or that blood sugar as fat because you need it for continued use of your muscles for whatever reason. It's like the body is getting ready to continue the stress response, and so puts away all of the ingredients it needs to continue to deal with that. So high insulin equals high inflammation. And the main way that we impact insulin is by how we eat. So this is a slide that many of you have seen before, but it's one of the most clear illustrations to me of what happens when we eat foods that raise blood sugar. So a glass of orange juice would spike my blood sugar probably up to, in me, it might spike to 160, 180, for instance. In some people, our sensitivity is different and it could spike higher. But if there's a spike in our blood sugar that's more than 30 points, that's a problem. So 30 points is normal function. If I start before breakfast with a blood sugar of 90 and I eat my breakfast and 45 minutes after my breakfast, my blood sugar was 120, that's pretty normal. But if my blood sugar spikes to 160, or something more than 30 points above where I started from, that's a situation where I'm going to have a huge surge of insulin, and I'm going to then have inflammation induced and storage induced from that food. So in this case, we see, for instance, a glass of orange juice or a flour-based food like a bagel, or a sugar-based food like a candy bar, and even a hamburger and soft drink, which, a lot of people sort of say, well, I let myself off the hook because there's a burger in there. The bun and the fries and the soft drink have so much sugar in them and such an impact on our blood sugar that they really still spike the blood sugar quite high. So this pattern of meals that raise blood sugar very high also then lead to a very high insulin level and a high inflammation level. And this right here, starting, really at age 18 months or however early we start feeding our children or started eating ourselves, this over years and years of time ends up leading to inflammation that's been sustained over years of time. And then we start to have breakdown. Usually that breakdown seems to happen sometime after the age of 50. It feels like it accelerates after that point. But what we're reaping really in that second half of our life is the impact of what we did prior. So if we look at this pattern and say, okay, that's the source of inflammation, one of the things we just described that we can keep in mind as a rule of thumb for all of our other choices is insulin as a switch. If insulin is low, if we can keep it at a pretty steady rate or a low rate, or if our overall insulin in a day is not real high, we're going to burn fat. And if insulin is high, we're going to burn carbohydrates as the preferred fuel. Now, carbohydrates are sugars, and you only have the capacity to burn a few carbs at a time. Your liver can burn about 15 grams of carbohydrate at a time. So if right now I eat 15 grams of carbohydrate, my liver is going to burn it up. I'm going to have a little bump in my insulin, but not a big spike. And I won't store any fat. I'll actually just burn it and use it because it's a small amount. But if I have a larger amount of carbohydrates, like that glass of orange juice, my body's going to burn it up, but whatever is extra that it can't burn up right now in this sitting is going to get stored as fat, and in particular will go to be made into cholesterol as well. So using insulin as a switch is a good clue in how we choose our foods, because if we can choose foods that keep our insulin low, then we're keeping it switched into the fat burning mode instead of the fat storage mode. And that looks more like this. This is a glucose insulin response curve of somebody who's eating low glycemic index meals or meals that don't spike blood sugar. And that'll end up keeping the insulin really nice and steady and much, much lower with almost no surges above the baseline level, which then in turn means we burn fat and also keep our blood sugar steady, which then means we have lower inflammation. And so we don't go down that whole disease path of developing cholesterol, storing fat, and making inflammation in the system. If you look at the foods that we eat, they each have a different impact on insulin. So you can see here that fat in the left side of this picture has the least impact on insulin. In fact, if you eat a fatty food like, and I'm going to use plant-based examples, like if I had olives, or if I had some nuts, or if I have butter, although I'm not going to eat that as a snack. But if I have a fatty food, it's not going to have much bump in my insulin levels. It has a glycemic index usually of less than 10. So almost zero as compared to sugar. Sugar has an index of 100, and fat has an index usually of 9 or lower depending on the food. If it was pure fat, it has no bump on the insulin level. Protein has a little bump. It takes some energy to digest our protein, and in fact, some of the protein gets turned into sugar for our muscles. So protein has a little bump in our insulin level, but our carbohydrates that are the non-fiber part of our carbohydrates are the food that has the biggest impact on our blood sugar and insulin level. And in fact, things like this, our flour-based foods that are made of particularly whole wheat or even white flour, have the biggest impact on bumping our blood sugar. And, Dr. Anderson, who's a mentor to many of us that have worked around low glycemic eating, says starches are going to be your success or your failure, how you deal with starches. So if you're using processed or prepackaged foods, you can almost always guarantee that those prepackaged foods are going to have higher glycemic indexes than whole foods. So finding foods in the natural form is going to be way better than packaged foods. And then choosing higher protein alternatives in your grain choices. So like choosing quinoa, or if you're making cookies, choosing an almond flour, are going to give you methods that have less starch in that meal or in that food. And then choosing vegetables and low glycemic fruits is another method that you can minimize your starch intake. This list at the bottom has been around a long time. Originally, Dr. Oz said avoid these things. So the white foods, white flour, white sugar are things that we would want to avoid. Typically, things also like rice and potatoes are foods that are more starchy, as well as the overt sugars like soda and cookies and donuts, candy and juices. And then French fries, unfortunately, happen to be a food that just gets into your bloodstream so quickly that they're at about an 80 to 90% similar impact as just straight sugar. So those are all foods that would tend to raise our blood sugar, and then in second impact from that would be that the insulin would rise. So when you think about other things that impact that insulin level, this is just a nice slide that gives you some other preview of a couple of the things I'm going to talk about for the rest of our time. We know that carbohydrates have the most impact on increasing our insulin. Certainly high volume of calories would also increase our insulin. If I was eating, let's pretend I could eat 10 cups of broccoli, that would even increase my insulin because that's a lot of food. But in normal amounts, a cup of broccoli is a very low glycemic food, and so it would be fine. So the total amount of calories is an impact. And then the frequency of our meals and snacking can increase insulin unless we're really conscious about how much we're getting at those meals. And then being sedentary or eating sort of nutritionally poor food or empty calories also tends to increase insulin because those tend to be high calorie but no nutritional value. But our insulin will come down when we have less high glycemic foods. So lower carbohydrate diet, a lower calorie intake, doing some patterning around how we eat as far as intermittent fasting or tiny meals makes a difference. And then high intensity exercise and really nutrient dense foods also tend to decrease our insulin levels. This is kind of a typical pattern in a day, and honestly, this is actually a pattern I've worked hard to do in my own life. I have personally been somebody who does best with small frequent eating. If you're someone who has had really unstable blood sugar levels, like you tend towards hypoglycemia, this is often a pattern that's really valuable for you to have small frequent meals. And one of the deciding factors for me in guiding people between a small frequent meal with low glycemic eating, that pattern, versus trying to get them into a ketogenic diet where they're adapted to eating a high-fat diet and don't eat as frequently. One of the biggest deciding patterns or deciding factors in that choice for me is whether they have good adrenal function. If stress in your life has tanked your adrenal glands, and so your cortisol and stress hormone production is really poor, you're going to be a person that has a harder time getting into a ketogenic fat burning program where you're not eating very often. So I will tend to choose the small frequent meal pattern for people who've had really high stress in their life over the ketogenic pattern, which is the high fat, no carb kind of a diet, because they will have an easier time adapting to the small frequent meals. It's easier on the adrenal system. One of the things I want to say that's a point that you know how you have an internal voice that sometimes contradicts things that other people say? So I was listening to two lecturers this weekend, and they said something about it not being a good idea to do something. And in my head, I had my little comeback. Well, one of the areas that I want to make out loud about that voice in my head is that a lot of people will say, well, small frequent meals make you have too much insulin in the day. That's only true if the content of your small frequent meals is bad. So, and by bad, I mean high glycemic. So if your small frequent meals are maybe 100 to 150 calories, and they are very well balanced with protein and fiber and some fat, they're not going to spike that insulin level through your day. So when we look at studies, it's easy to see studies where people are eating, 5 and 6 times a day, but maybe they're eating foods that are not great for them, and then they have higher insulin than someone who's doing fasting and eating 1 or 2 meals a day. But the difference is content of the food in that, not just the frequency. So you kind of have to apply both the content information and how frequently you eat, and combine those two pieces of information in choosing whether or not you're going to eat 5 to 6 small low glycemic meals a day versus an intermittent fasting or a ketogenic diet where you can go longer between meals. So just to summarize, when I say that we want to lower insulin, which comes from a stable blood sugar, eating to keep that blood sugar stable by our food choices is really paramount. And usually that'll mean we're eating mostly plants and protein, and we're avoiding the processed carbohydrates or the flour-based foods. So I want to mention that there's 3 methods that I typically choose between to advise people on how to do this. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about each one of them. Eating a small snack or meal every 3 hours is the gentlest, and in some ways, maybe the broadest as far as your food choices method. It's almost like saying, okay, we're going to go with close to a Mediterranean diet with small meals and snacks every 3 hours. The other 2 methods I'll come back to and after I talk about the first one. I'll talk for a little bit about ketogenic diets and intermittent fasting, just because there are other ways that we can keep the blood sugar stable and lower our insulin. So I tend to choose, like choosing from a toolbox, I will choose between a program where we're eating small frequent meals, and I really learned that program first by using OPTIBIA and its even predecessor, which was Take Shape for Life. I learned that methodology by doing that myself. I literally had been a person that had coffee with lots of cream and sugar in it as I went out the door in the morning and then didn't eat until about 1 o'clock. And would find that I just got really stressed feeling and anxious feeling mid-morning, and later realized after I did the OPTIBIA program, I realized it was because I had super low blood sugar. I probably was crashing with my blood sugar after having had so much sugar and cream in my coffee first thing in the morning. So that period of time for me, I know that I was both very highly stressed and not eating adequate protein and not keeping my blood sugar steady because I wasn't eating in a pattern that would allow a normal blood sugar. So I learned small frequent eating first by using OPTIBIA, and then really dug in to understand how to keep doing that in a maintenance style even the rest of my life. So OPTIBIA, some people are like, well, what is it and why do you use it? OPTIBIA is a program that teaches habits that are healthy habits, and it honestly also has beautifully easy structured meals that are in little packages. So in general, I would say for our lifelong health, we want to figure out a way to eat as much whole food as possible. And with OPTIBIA, a lot of times people don't know how to do the whole food diet right this minute, and they want to get started, and I need to keep their attention while we're learning about habits of health. And so what I love about OPTIBIA is that it's a very clean program where there's not artificial sweeteners or artificial products in the food, but someone can learn to eat small frequent meals that are low glycemic meals that really lead to results that are rapid and quick and pretty predictable. A lot of people will say, well, what is OPTIBIA? And I say it really should be, who is OPTIBIA? Because when we think about programs that work around sustaining healthy body and healthy lifestyle, they really have a major social component. And OPTIBIA is built on the concept of having a health coach and a community around you that is going to stand for making good choices in your health. And so I was initially attracted to OPTIBIA because it was predictable in its results, and it had a very simple, structured program. What I quickly learned with my patients was that it was the community and the coaching that made that program successful. So OPTIBIA is a group of people that are working towards health learning together and eating in a pattern that sustains health, as well as starting to put into place goals that are habits that help people reach their goals for overall health. Because even if I was at my perfect weight, or even if my inflammation was low in my body, Do I have the life I want, which is really the whole point of why we're wanting to be healthy in the first place. So OPTIBIA is a system that supports that big picture thinking. And what I realized as I was starting to really, in my office about 10 years ago, be desperate for a system that worked really simply for people, was that the social contagiousness of our health really meant that I needed a system that allowed for community and for coaching and for support in a group type of a method, and that's what OPTIBIA provided. So within the OPTIBIA program, if you come into my office and you and I are sitting down and we're talking about how to lower your blood sugar, how to stabilize your your insulin, or how to lose weight, I'm going to say that OPTIBIA would be your simplest method. It's a very easy method that is set up in a very structured way, and it has 4 components. It has a coach that's going to check in with you every day for your first 4 days as you start your new eating program. It has a system of teaching health habits. There's an educational system, and there are calls and group chats and webinars that help you learn about habits of health that you would want to implement in your life. There's a community that's out there. Literally, there are people that are hosting cooking events in their home. There are calls that you can be on with a nurse that allow for asking questions. There's a huge community, both online and in person, with OPTIBIA. And then there's a fueling system that allows you to replicate that slide I showed you a little bit ago where your blood sugar was low with really nice small meal increments and keeping your insulin low. That is done initially in OPTIBIA by using fuelings that are set up to be exactly what you need to hold your blood sugar steady for 3 hours. So those fuelings I want to talk about for a minute, because this is actually how I started to dig in and then eventually went and did my boards in obesity medicine. It was because of learning about the science behind these fuelings. Each of the OPTIBIA fuelings happens, in fact, very clearly designed to be this way, happens to be a maximum of 15 grams of carbohydrate. What I learned as I studied about that is more than 15 grams of carbohydrate is more than your liver can process. So if you can eat at each one of your snacks in your 5 to 6 small meals a day, if you can eat 15 grams of carbohydrates or less, you're going to not build cholesterol. You're not going to raise cholesterol. You'll have enough, but not too much. And that's because your liver can process that amount of carbohydrate and use it for your muscle needs and your organ needs, but not store the excess, because there's no excess. It gets used up. So each of these fuelings is exactly the same in its what we call macronutrient content. Each one has about 15 grams of carbohydrate. Each one has low saturated fat. Each one has about 5 grams of fiber, and each one has about 10 to 12 grams of protein. That pattern happens to be and was clearly actually based on science from Johns Hopkins University and from their obesity program. That pattern is the right combination to keep your blood sugar steady and to lower insulin. So no matter which fueling you use, whether I eat these pancakes that have protein in them, or whether I have this brownie that has 10 to 12 grams of protein and no more than 15 grams of carbohydrate, any one of those items actually has the right amount of protein and carbohydrates and fiber to sustain my blood sugar without it spiking, but to sustain it for about 3 hours. And the biggest move, the difference, I started working with this program when it had a different name. And the biggest move was we as health coaches kept saying, we want cleaner food products. We don't want to be using food that has artificial anything in it. And so that change really came about when we became a new company called OPTIBIA. And OPTIBIA is using no GMO ingredients and has no artificial sweeteners or, artificial products in it. And every meal replacement has probiotics in it and vitamins and minerals. So when I work on helping people set up a 5 to 6 meal a day program, and if you're using OPTIBIA to be that meal, it literally is looking at your day kind of in this framework. If you get up, let's say you get up at 6 o'clock, you want to eat within the first half hour of when you rise so that you start that metabolism actually functioning. And that first meal, if it was going to be an OPTIBIA meal, could be, for instance, the oatmeal that they have protein fortified. Regular oatmeal doesn't have near enough protein in it to be a healthy breakfast. It's actually a high glycemic food if you don't add protein to it. So with OPTIBIA protein, or OPTIBIA oatmeal, it has about 10 to 12 grams of protein in that little packet of oatmeal. So maybe you have oatmeal first thing in the morning at 6:30. 3 hours later is 9:30. So at 9:30, you would have another small, low glycemic meal. And if it was with OPTIBIA, it might be a shake, or it might be a bar. It maybe 9:30 in the morning. Then at 12:30, 3 hours later, you would fuel again. And in the program with OPTIBIA, you have one or two, depending on which program you've chosen with your health coach, you have one or two meals that are lean and green, we call them. So they're lean protein and green vegetables. And so those meals can be interjected in any of these slots. It could be at lunchtime if you're going to a luncheon, or it could be at dinner time with your family, or it could be at breakfast if it's Sunday and you want to have it as a brunch. And then the other meals are kept at that 100 to 110 calorie intake, which is exactly what's in every fueling. What that does is generate this pattern where we have really nice, steady blood sugars, which allow for a very low baseline insulin all through the day. And that's drastic in lowering inflammation in the body and lowering the cortisol level as well. And so people end up having good energy and feeling more calm and not storing fat when they're eating in a pattern that supports this kind of a blood sugar response. Two people that I know that I want to mention, and these are people who inspired me as I started using OPTIBIA. I had, for the 9 years before I found the OPTIBIA program, I had put many, many people on healthy eating programs where they were eating the right food. They were eating, or they were going to try to eat the right food, I guess I would say. They were going to try to do whole foods, and we would make shopping lists, and I would write out eating plans with them. What I found is that for most people, they have no lack of knowledge. We all know the right things to eat, but we are all really busy and we're all fairly stressed. And sometimes eating right just goes by the wayside. It's the first thing to go when the week is crazy, or when you're running out the door in the morning to get to work. And so these two people are friends that I've now come to know very well. Shirley is a grandma who had not thought she was going to live another year when she was this weight. And she decided when she started her health journey that she really wanted, like her number one goal was to be able to see grandchildren. She didn't have grandkids at that point, and she was afraid she would never live to see kids, her kids have her kids. What I know now is that she has multiple grandchildren, and she gets up and down off the floor easily to play with those grandchildren. And in fact, this last week when a dear friend passed away, Shirley is actually at that home and has been there as a helper to the family that needed support. Ron is also somebody who was this jovial, he likes to say he was a stripper because he was a furniture stripper for years. He was a fine craftsman with furniture. But again, someone who had really, by the pattern of life, not been able to keep his weight down. And when they started OPTIBIA, both of them achieved a healthy weight, lowered inflammation, and now have kept this weight off for years. And so these are people that I see when I do any training with OPTIBIA that are helping other people as coaches because that made such a difference in their lives. So when we look at what was successful and why the OPTIBIA program works, it's because it lowers insulin. The other part of that is that when you lower insulin and when you eat healthy, you tend to stick with that pattern once it's become a habit. And one of the things that makes it become a habit is repetition and structure. And so the beautiful thing about the OPTIBIA program is that because you have a coach checking in with you and because you have an easy system to do, even when life has been busy, people are successful quickly and then are able to integrate those habits into their lifestyle for the long term. So I want to talk briefly about some of these other methods because people will say, well, should I eat more fat? And what I'll say is of these methods, you really kind of have to choose between something like the OPTIBIA program where you're eating lower calories with consistent protein And you can eat healthy fat, but not necessarily the kind of fat amounts that a ketogenic diet would be, which a ketogenic diet is a really high-fat diet with no starches. You want the carbohydrates in that particular approach less than 50 grams, which is a very, very low amount if you're going to be on that type of a program. So a ketogenic diet, I'm not going to go into much more than to say, is a great option for someone, particularly in maintenance. If you've lost your weight, and losing weight is often easier to do with the small frequent meals, but if you're going to then use ketogenesis as a way to sustain your weight in the long term, it really means cutting out and staying off carbohydrates. You can't say, I'm going to do high-fat diet 5 days a week and the small frequent meals with lots of, with a higher amount of carbohydrate in them on the weekend. You kind of need to pick one or the other and stick with that approach. But I want to talk about intermittent fasting because you can combine intermittent fasting with either the small frequent meals or the ketogenic diet and make that diet work better for you. So this is just a diagram that's fairly simple about what happens to insulin after you eat. And granted, the amount that the insulin starts out at is going to be different depending on how big the meal you ate was and whether it was low glycemic. But insulin tends to drop at about 3 hours, comes back down to its baseline, and then even 10 hours after a meal, it drops again. So we can use that information to our advantage about the pattern of how we eat. If you look at this slide, it's describing really the difference between a typical American diet in a person's insulin level versus a low carbohydrate diet like OPTIBIA or like a ketogenic diet would even be a little lower. And then fasting, actually, where you're not eating, even has a lower insulin level, which kind of makes sense. But this is describing what happens after about 10 hours after having had a meal. So fasting actually gets your insulin even lower if you go, for that 10 hours without a meal. The thing about it is that if you want to combine using some of the principles of healthy eating, which is what's on this slide around saying, let's make sure that we slow down with eating and have more fat in our meals because that helps us get full and gives us flavor, as well as food with high fiber. All of those breaks that nature puts in can be used in combination with a pattern of how we eat so that we optimize the body cleaning itself up. And so I'm going to go back to that this slide for just a moment. Intermittent fasting is a scenario where you control the amount of food that you eat into certain hours of the day. So many people are doing what they call a 16-8 or an 8-16, where they eat for 8 hours of the day and then fast for 16 hours of the day with nothing but non-caloric drinks during that time frame. So things like tea and coffee and water are the things you might drink during the fasting hours. By combining that fasting of 16 hours a day along with low glycemic eating during the midpoint of your day, that 8 hours that you do eat, you can actually accelerate your plan. Or if you're doing a ketogenic diet where you're doing higher fat but really low carbs, but you only eat during an 8-hour period of the day, you can combine either of those approaches with intermittent fasting and accelerate your success. And so we're finding in the office that those two concepts, the concept of keeping your blood sugar steady, either by small frequent meals like a program that OPTIBIA uses, or as like OPTIBIA, or by using a ketogenic diet where you're eating higher fat, but basically no carbohydrates except for vegetables. If you combine either of those approaches with intermittent fasting, you're going to have a better success rate. Fasting seems to allow for the body to do some cleanup. There's a word, different people say this word differently. So whichever way you've heard it, autophagy or autophagy. Auto means self and phagy means eat. And so during the hours that you're fasting, your body will start to do autophagy or autophagy and do some cleanup. It'll clean up broken cells. It'll clean up free radicals or oxidized cells. And you'll actually end up having sort of a clean out effect and a fat burning effect because of being in that fasting state. during that, say, 16 hours of the day. There are other intermittent fasting programs where people just eat really low calories, like 500 calories for 2 days of the week, and have more general, typical eating on the other days. That's a little less successful, but it is successful if you're careful also about what you're eating, even on your 5 days that are not the fasting days. And you can use OPTIBIA as your 500 calories on the fasting days in that program as well. So there's lots and lots of variations on how you can combine this, but basically I wanted to just sort of bring out that there's two main methods to stabilize insulin and blood sugar. They're either small frequent feedings that are low glycemic meals, or a ketogenic approach, which would be a higher fat, very low carb diet. And then you can combine intermittent fasting or controlling the hours of the day that you eat with either of those programs to accelerate your success. I hope that's been helpful, and I'm going to turn our slides over to our screen share so that we can answer any questions as we think about sort of the impact of trying to stabilize blood sugar to achieve health and how we can practically apply that in our lives. Okay. We're back, and I am at a spot where I can look at the chat box now and see any questions there. I certainly think that one of the things about dietary discussions is they can feel confusing, and I think that's one of the things. Shauna Perry, who was my first coach and one of my very first clients who worked with me on OPTIBIA, had asked me recently, what was the main features that made you know that OPTIBIA was going to be a plan you wanted to use in your office? And what I told her is that it was really structured and predictable. And so I think for a lot of us, something that's structured and predictable is a real help, because our lives tend to have so much chaos, it feels like, in them, that's one of the beautiful things about that approach and using that program. OPTIBIA makes it really simple to eat healthy, and I still use OPTIBIA products myself frequently because life is chaotic enough that I sometimes have days where I haven't prepped and cut up fruits and vegetables and protein to take with me from other food. So one of the things about deciding what to do in the plan that you would choose to either lower fat or reduce inflammation is that I would welcome working with you on that, because there are certainly factors like figuring out if your adrenal glands are really tanked, and you can probably tell me almost or answer for yourself. If stress has been super high for you, then it's going to make sense to start with the small frequent meal approach, because it's gentler on your system and it's more predictable in its results. But I'm curious, if there's any questions, I would certainly be happy to take those at this time. I know that sometimes it's a little bit different trying to ask a question on this format with Zoom. One of the things that is worth mentioning is like what's typical in these different programs. For instance, what's the weight loss I would expect if someone's on OPTIBIA versus doing it themselves, versus with whole foods and small frequent meals, versus a ketogenic diet where they've tried to cut most of their starches out. I actually would say the most predictable of those is the OPTIBIA program. It's why I keep it as a tool right now in my toolbox, so to speak, because it is so predictable that I can tell my patients, if you go on program, if you're a woman, you always hate to use the word guarantee in the medical world, but you can almost guarantee that someone's going to lose at least 10 pounds in their first month. Most people lose weight more quickly at the beginning of a program than later, if the program is working and helping them get into fat burning. So with OPTIBIA, I've seen hugely predictable results in the first month for most women between 10 and 15 pounds, sometimes a little less if it's somebody with a really low metabolic rate. And then, if, for instance, if someone was going to lose around 60 pounds, I would tell them that that's probably a 4 to 6 month time frame to lose 60 pounds using the OPTIBIA program. And then we transition from there. We start to add more whole food back in and still use the OPTIBIA as a really good backup if they're needing something that makes it easy between meals, or when I'm at a conference for a day, I still use OPTIBIA as my fueling for the day. So Typically it'll average out to maybe 10 pounds a month over time, but there's a faster rate of weight loss with OPTIBIA at the beginning. If I'm doing a ketogenic diet with somebody, it takes longer. It feels like it's a little bit more of a slow process, but still successful, kind of maybe twice as long. And if someone's trying to do this themselves, my main struggle and concern, if we're just launching into, like right now, if I was just going to move into whole food eating 5 to 6 times a day, is that staying on that consistently is difficult for people because life happens and there'll be one day where they don't prep 5 to 6 small meals for themselves. If they're able to do it, it works. It just takes a little longer. So OPTIBIA is the most predictable, ketogenic probably the next, and then working with whole food, small frequent meals on your own, maybe the next as far as the speed of weight loss over time, I would say, overall. Is there anybody on the call that wants to share what's worked for them between any of these different programs, or your own experience in trying to sort of get your body adjusted to any of the programs you've tried? If you do want to speak, you just have to unmute yourself down at the bottom left of your screen. One of the experiences that we had this week, one of our patients stopped back in who's been on program, I think about a month, and they've lost 20 pounds. And right now they're in a little bit of a plateau, which happens with weight loss programs. You can have, you can be losing weight and then your body seems like it goes into restructure mode and you may not see the scale move for a few days. When that happens, what's happening inside is the body is reorganizing, and a lot of times other beautiful things are happening about inflammation dropping. And this person who is in that spot right now said, you know what, here's what's crazy is I feel so good, and having lost the 20 pounds even though that's not where I want to get to eventually, I feel so good energy-wise and mental clarity-wise that I know that things are working even though the scale hasn't budged for a few days. And I think that's often a common report we get from our clients. In my office, if you were to start OPTIBIA, I'm going to introduce you to a coach, either Robert Brosfield, my husband, or Shauna Perry, who's a coach with me, will coach you through your process, and they're going to be checking in and be a touch point along with me in the office. And in the office, what I do with any weight loss program is we offer B12 supplementation and check-ins where you can do an in-body and check on your body composition and your body fat and muscle. And that's one of the beautiful things about using a balanced program like OPTIBIA is that people don't lose muscle. And so I love it that we can use the in-body and you can stop in and do a quick check to see how you're doing and monitor your progress on your program. Are there any questions? Well, thank you for, I see Shauna popping on for a second.
Well, I just, it's hard for me not to talk. But I don't, and just a little bit about the OPTIBIA is that, I am one of those people that you hand wrote program after program for, and that I did, I was probably the most critical of the Take Shape for Life or OPTIBIA program when I was first introduced to it, because two reasons, right? I kind of felt like I didn't understand it, and I had a concept of what buying your food was like. And then the other part of that, it was the fear of failing, right? Because I tried everything, and there's nothing. I keep all of my weight loss books on hand to remind me of just how much money I threw at failure. And then the complete success that I had for this program made me such an advocate. And since I am such a skeptic, anybody who knows me pretty much got on board, because if I had done the research, then they knew that they could trust that. But I think it's the long-term commitment to health that makes all of the difference, and the educational component that we had with this. People get stuck on the food. They really get focused on that. And I think probably I told you after the first week, it didn't really matter. It doesn't matter. It's fuel. So while this is an amazing product, it's just food. It's only food, in the right size, right quantities, right proportion. It's still just food. And but it is the education that I received from that, from the long term, and most definitely the support of having somebody help me get to where I want, even when I didn't want help, or when I thought I didn't want help, and then how important that was. So thank you for doing this particular piece this week on this program, because I just think it's an important element, and it's a choice. It's a very good choice of many that are out there.
Absolutely. And Shauna, thank you for bringing that up, because, it's funny, as a doctor, I tend to get mired in the numbers and the micronutrients and the macronutrients and those things. And it is so, so true. And in my own journey, in my own health, and also then in working with patients and with friends and now many people that have, changed their health. The thing that has happened long-term is, you're right, it's not about the food. It really is about the process and the learning. And just as a personal testimony, my own learning in this whole process started with OPTIBIA. I started with Take Shape for Life and Dr. Anderson teaching in a community setting about health. And so you're right, the community aspect of it, the health coach, the educational system are what's unique, because there are lots of diets out there. There's lots of food plans. I mean, it's not that small packaged meals and 100 calories are only from this program. There are other ones, even though I don't think many of them hit all the marks. But it's not just the food. It's really that you're doing all of these things at the same time. You're reorienting the mental focus, really starting to notice what's working and what's not working and what your own goals are. You have an educational system around learning what's healthy. How do you learn about low glycemic eating? How do you learn about structuring your life around what's important to you? Are you asking why and living to your potential, really, for the lifelong side of things? And who's asking you about that? Like, are you surrounding yourself by people who care, right, about the big picture? So that was all part of OPTIBIA that really changed my life too, from the standpoint of just my own professional focus and where I wanted to learn more and how I wanted to support people. So I thank you for putting that in.
Well, it is kind of a cult with its own language. And what I love is meeting up with somebody. There's so many people who have used this program to their benefit, but meeting somebody you've never met before who's on the program, and all of a sudden the language starts with, are you eating the chocolate mint, or what? Yeah. It goes from there to the education. But anyway, thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you, Shauna. Definitely. And I think the other piece of that is that being able to keep coming back. Here's the thing. The three faces, if you can see our faces on the screen, Shauna, Robert, and I, are people who've used this program of healthy eating and being accountable to each other now for 10 years. So when you think about that, it really is that you can develop a group support system that's going to stick with you for a lifetime, and that this is a process. And I fall down, I get back up, and Shauna or Robert or other people around me are there to cheer me on. And it's not a straight shot where there's no fall downs. Robert likes to say it's practice, not perfection. So I think that's really key, and it's good to be in a group of people who are practicing.